What is up, guys? Doug Polk here, and we're back with another episode of Poker Hands. Today we're going to be looking at a Greg Merson 2012 World Series of Poker final table hand, and you will not believe what he does on the river. Without ado, let's go ahead and roll the clip.
Merson.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Limps for 800,000 from the button.
Jesse calls.
Phil Ivey coming back to his seat. Sylvia calls for 400,000, and Balsiger decides to raise.
And this could have been a three-way pot. Merson just limped on the button. Yeah, in position, he's going to call a lot of hands to take a flop with.
A call from Merson, and Sylvia makes way to make it a heads-up battle.
Our hand begins with Greg Merson limping into the pot on the button with Queen Jack suited. Now, while I understand why he might be limping, if you get 3-bet, you're playing a pretty large pot with a suited connector. Queen Jack suited is still definitely strong enough to be opening into the pot. What I will say is I don't exactly know what Jesse Sylvia's stack in the small blind is, and maybe if he's on 15-ish type blinds, it could be a more reasonable play to limp, because if you raise and get jammed on, you're going to be put in an awkward situation. However, unless Jesse Sylvia is on that 10 to 20 big blind type stack, I would really like to see Merson raise the button. Sylvia completes the small blind, and now the action is on Jake Balsiger in the big blind. Jake now decides to raise it up with Queen 10 offsuit. I'm not a big fan of this play, and here's the reason why. What's he planning on doing if the button decides to raise? Well, now he has a very difficult situation because he has a hand that's a pretty good hand, no doubt, but he's out of position against someone that's repping a very strong range of hands now. He's saying he has a hand that trapped pre-flop, like aces or kings or queens, ace, king, etc. So, I'd prefer to raise with some hands that can easily fold when facing a re-raise or are strong enough to continue against aggression from my opponents. But anyway, he opens it up with Queen 10, and Merson decides to flat with Queen Jack suited, definitely the standard play, and Sylvia gets out of there. Let's take a look at the flop.
If this pot develops into anything a little bit bigger, Balsiger could take the chip lead away from Merson here.
Tray 9-8. Balsiger in the blind 2-act. Merson with position on the button. ...21-year-old trying to battle Merson, the 24-year-old. It seems like their ages are much more varied than 21 and 24, doesn't it?
Well, we're talking 7 million hands online against a guy who's probably playing war against his grandfather 5 years ago at home.
Jake bets 4.5.
This three-handed battle, almost 4 hours old now. And still have not lost anybody tonight.
80 hands into three-handed battle. We've only had one all-in and a call when Balsiger's had the pocket jacks against.
The flop comes 9-8-3 rainbow, and Balsiger decides to continuation bet 4.5 million into a pot of 8.5 million. Now, I pretty much like everything about this play. I like the size he chose, a little over half pot usually makes the most sense on a continuation bet. And I also like the hand he's selecting here, or the hand he's selecting here. Queen 10 can make the nuts on a jack. So when you have these kinds of straight draws that can improve the nuts as well as top pair on a queen or a 10, it makes a lot of sense to bet them to try and get your opponent to fold a hand like king and jack or ace 6, etc. Hands that have you beat in a median showdown value and have an equity or are equity favorites against your hand, but can't really continue versus a bet because if you're not bluffing, they're almost dead. So this hand makes a lot of sense to bet. Merson now has two options on the button, and they're both fine. He can decide to call and try and play some later streets, or he can work in a raise here, representing a hand like 9-8, or some kind of, I guess really only pocket threes would be limping the button. I don't exactly know what his limping strategy is, but he could elect to raise here, representing 9-8 or pocket threes, planning on barreling when he improves to a queen, jack, or 10, as well as a heart. However, I would probably recommend call, because that way you protect your range with some of these overcard backdoor flush draw type hands that can face aggression on some turns like a queen or jack or a 10 turn. And also you don't have too many bluffs raising the flop. If you're going to raise every gut shot in the flop, you have way too many hands because it's so easy to have a gut shot in this flop. 7-5, 6-5, 10-6, Jack 7, queen 10, queen jack. There's so many gut shots. If you just raise all of them, you're going to bluff way too much considering you only have 9-8 and 3-3 for value. That said, I don't exactly know what he is limping on the button. Maybe he has more hands like 9-9 or 8-8. Maybe he has a few hands that would trap pre-flop like aces. I kind of doubt that. I think he would lean towards limp re-raising those hands. But at the same time, he does have a few good hands, but not many. So in situations like that, you want to be careful with what you raise, and I like his decision to call. Let's go ahead and take a look at the turn.
Now the 4 of hearts comes out.
If Balsiger has the overpair, certainly I think he's going to follow through again on the turn. That's a pretty insignificant card. Merson just called the button and called for a raise, so capable of having cards that work with that flop on some level. He could have a hand like 10 jack, maybe even queen 10. Wouldn't be shocked to see just a pair of 8s in his hand, maybe even just a 3. So he called him once on the flop. Let's see what happens on the turn. We'll get more information. Balsiger certainly could represent an overpair by a big bet here on the turn. There's 17.5 million chips in the pot.
And the long, lanky arm of the 21-year-old reaching for the red chips. A lot of red chips.
If Merson calls or more, there will be a new contention for the chip leader.
7.5 million from Jake Balsiger. See Merson twitch just a little bit there.
And this is really where the pressure amounts. I mean, if Merson called him with just one pair or maybe a couple overcards and a gutter, it's pretty hard to keep going, but I don't think Merson believes him.
7.5 million from Merson.
The turn is the 4 of hearts, giving Greg Merson a backdoor flush draw to go along with his straight draw. So he improves, but still doesn't have a made hand. Balsiger still has a gut shot, but still has a very reasonable bluff candidate. Again, he can improve the nuts with a jack, has 2 overcards, and if his opponent has a hand like, let's say, ace-jack that floated the flop, or a 3, or maybe a weak 8, those types of holdings, he might be inclined to fold the turn because of these overpair type hands Balsiger can have. I mean, he's really representing that he has 10s plus now with his turn bet. Now, one thing I will say I dislike about this turn bet from Balsiger is he needs to use a larger bet size. He's betting 7.5 million into around 17 million. It's not even half pot. He needs to bet a size that gears up for a river jam and puts Merson in a tough spot with some hands like an 8. Now, sure, when he has this hand, a hand that draws to essentially the nuts with both the straight and the flush, he's not really going to fold almost no matter what size he bets. Sure, if he goes all in, he'll fold, but all reasonable sizes he's going to continue versus. So it wouldn't have made a difference really here, but I think you need to make a bigger sized bet in spots where you're saying you have an overpair and you think it's likely your opponent has either a weak hand, some kind of weak pair, or a straight draw. Now, he can also have a 9 for top pair, but those hands are going to be much less frequent than all of these straight draws we discussed he could have on the flop. So maybe this bet is kind of targeting those weaker straight draws, weaker pairs, and that way he thinks he loses less when his opponent has a 9. But the way I look at it now, if he has an 8, he's always going to call, and then the straight draws like Jack 10, 10-7, 6-5, 7-6, those hands are all much more able to call because they're getting a very reasonable price on the turn. So I would like to see Balsiger bet more like 10, 11, 12 million, 2/3 pot type bet, really say, hey man, I have an overpair here, you need to lay down whatever you have, and prepare himself to be able to shove the river. In fact, if he had taken that line, this hand would have gone a very different direction. Maybe Greg Merson doesn't win the main. Anyway, spoilers aside, Balsiger bet 7.5 million. Merson now calls the clear play with his gut shot as well as flush draw. Raising could be okay, but I think calling and electing to use his position makes more sense. So let's go ahead and look at the river.
6 of spades now. So on the board of Trey, 9-8-4-6. 2 spades, 2 hearts, so no flush possibilities.
It's unlikely Merson had a hand like 9-6. It's possible he had a hand like 8-6 suited and just limped the button.
32.5 million chips at stake right now. And perhaps the chip lead.
There were definitely worse river cards for Balsiger, but that's not one of the best if he has what he's actually trying to represent.
Jake reaching for chips again. He's running out of the reds.
Jake bets.
He might actually have it.
$13 million.
So, you know, if he actually has what he's representing, it would be very tough for him to call a shove here, putting his entire tournament at stake. And that's definitely a play up Merson's arsenal.
Here comes Merson now. Chips in hand, but maybe just thinking chips. Boy, he understands the gravity of this hand.
Yeah, I think Merson just has a pair. Trying to.
The pieces all
wow.
in.
I love that play. I absolutely love that play.
And a fold from Balsiger. And it was Queen Jack of hearts for Merson.
And that is what separates the men from the boys. That was amazing.
Oh my goodness. And Ivey loves it as well.
That's why Phil Ivey rails him.
Oh my goodness.
The river is the 6 of spades, and both players brick their draws. And now it's really going to come down to who's got the balls to take this pot down. And I really dislike the size that Balsiger decides to bet here on the river. Because by betting 13 million, you're not really going to get Merson to fold a hand like a 9 ever. Those hands are going to have to call because the price is too good. In fact, if he has an 8, which called on the turn, he might be able to convince himself to call with that hand as well. So he's not putting enough pressure on these weak pairs by having an overpair. If he bets the turn a bigger size and then jams the river for about 2/3 pot turn, 2/3, 3/4 pot river, he allows himself room to stack a hand like a 9 or an 8 when he has an overpair, and also to bluff with hands like Queen 10. Now, I like choosing Queen 10 to bluff with. In fact, Queen 10, Jack 10, Queen Jack, those are the kinds of hands you should choose to bluff with if you can have them in this spot. I might not have all of those pre-flop as we talked about earlier, but they make sense. You know, you have a draw on the earlier streets that you can bluff with, and then everything else kind of gets there. If you have a hand like 7-5 suited or 7-6, you pair it up. 7-5 suited has a straight, all of these types of hands. So Queen high, not going to win, makes a good bluff. I like the decision to use it. I just don't like the size. And here is where Greg Merson just bosses it up and jams over the top with his queen high and shows him what's up. And look, I understand in poker when you get one through, it's awesome, and we should really embrace that. But I have to say I don't like the selection of this hand to do it with, because let's think about, let's just say you're in Merson's, actually let's talk about Balsiger. Let's say you're in Balsiger's shoes, and he bets, and you bet the river, and you get jammed on. Well, what hands do you always have to fold? Your bluffs. If he has Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, maybe a hand like King Jack of hearts, if he has those hands, he has to fold, period. There's no, oh, maybe my opponent has a bluff. Like, you're bluffing. You can barely beat anything. If your opponent has 2 random cards, you're behind. I mean, obviously they don't. So the thing is, in that spot, you have to fold. Now, if he has a hand like queens or kings, which is kind of what he's trying to say here with this story, now he has to make a decision. But the thing is this, it's a decision. It's not a snap fold. I mean, he folds immediately in this hand because he's like, I have queen I have to fold, right? And, you know, to be fair, he was beat. But the thing is, if he has a hand like queens or kings, he has a decision and might be able to call. So what can we deduce from this? We want him to have more bluffs if possible. So there's 2 things to think about on the river here when you're trying to figure out what hand do I want to bluff with. The first thing is you don't want to have a heart in your hand, because if you have a heart, your opponent is less likely to be bluffing. I know that's a weird concept, but if you have 2 hearts in your hand, how is Balsiger ever going to have a bricked flush draw? He's really not. Maybe they're not flush draw, but that's kind of it. So you don't want to block these hands your opponent can have, and then that would just fall into a jam. And then second off, you don't want to have a queen, a jack, or a 10 in your hand, because those are the main hands that Balsiger is going to be able to bluff with. It's way better to make this play if you have a hand like ace-3 that decided to call flop, turn was close, but you went with it, and on the river, you know he's less likely to have a set of 3s or aces, and you don't block any of those bluff-type hands. Maybe it makes more sense to make this play with a hand like maybe an 8, maybe a weak 8, or an 8 that doesn't block some other types of holdings. Those could be more reasonable. But queen jack of hearts, other than maybe I guess jack 10 of hearts, is probably the worst hand you can select to bluff with. So I'll give the play some props. Definitely put him in a spot, and sometimes you have to make moves to win big tournaments. But I don't think this was the hand to use for it. And the great thing about poker is you can always try and select a better hand in these instances. Now, I know you don't get that many shots when you're playing the main event. You're 3-handed, and this is really your one chance to win. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you can kind of forget about good poker fundamentals and start just winging it and doing stuff, because this is a strategy game and you want to play the best strategy. So I like the play, don't like the hand. I actually think Balsiger played post-flop totally fine. I just don't like his bet size. And I just thought this was an interesting hand I wanted to cover, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for joining me here today for Poker Hands from my makeshift San Diego studio. If you're interested in more poker hands and strategy news type shows in the future, subscribe to the channel, click the button, and join the team. The answer is they're both completely wrong. Ace-Jack here should be a check call. Let's think about the kinds of hands that Torelli is going to call his all-in with. Always going to be calling with a flush, always should be calling with a set, always should be calling with ace-queen.